Okay, we're recording. Well, welcome you guys. And we've got a special guest today. Roy Moran is a great friend of mine. I consider him a mentor. I remember years ago when we were first being introduced to DMM, somebody gave me Spent Matches. And you guys, it's a book he wrote. If you haven't read Spent Matches, you've got to read Spent Matches. It is a powerful book. Definitely set us on fire. Roy, I think I finished the book and I immediately emailed you and just said, we have got to talk. Roy was the only one I had ever heard of in a North American context implementing DMM. And so he's been at it a lot longer than, really probably any of us. And so he wrote to me, and I know to many people in the different communities in the U.S. that are catalyzing movement. So he's a pastor, senior pastor at Shoal Creek in Kansas City. Some of you guys are aware of that, Kansas City, Missouri. And he hosts a monthly sandbox call. I know Sean, you went through one of his trainings and you may have been on those, and some others have been to those. So Roy, I always tell people that Roy is the ultimate connector. When I got to know Roy, I got to know everybody else I needed to know. Okay, so now you guys can say y'all know Roy because you're here today, and I'm sure he would be glad for you to reach out to him about anything you need. But he can connect you with whatever resource you may need, or if you have a question about your implementation of DMM, he's the expert, okay, especially in a North American context. So I've invited him to just come and share with you guys. I said, Roy, share anything on your heart, but definitely we're interested in a DMM in it was a North American context, but now a North American and a European context, a Western context for sure. And Roy just always has great insights into kind of where we're at, where we need to go, what our focus should be. So I'm going to let him share for a few minutes, and then you guys may have some questions as he shares, and we can take those. And then after that, we'll break into our groups and do some accountability. So Roy, welcome. We're glad you're here.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. The love fest goes both ways. Chris is one of my favorite people. In fact, he just called me about an hour and 30 minutes ago and said, hey, do you have 10 minutes on the phone? And 45 minutes later, we got off. So no, it's thanks, Chris, so much for what you're doing, how you do it. And your friendship means the world to me, man. So I appreciate you having me here. So it's great to be along. I don't know. I'm usually more used to responding to questions. I always approach a context like this believing I don't really have anything to say. It's the learner in the process that has the need. So I'll just say a few things, and then if you guys have questions you want to throw in the chat, I'll feel free to respond to those kinds of things as well. But I think when I got into this process, I was talking to Dave Hunt as a guy at City Team, and I was trying to ask him. I had been with the City Team folks. I'd been introduced to these guys, all the stories and miraculous movements that you read about, all the real people behind it. And I was just, it was like, a kid in Disney World or something. I mean, it's just like incredible seeing this kind of stuff happen, because I'd always had this kind of Great Commission heart about me and stuff. And so I just started, and I remember writing Dave and him saying, and he was a real busy guy. So I said, Dave, I don't want to take much of your time. Just give me a few names. Just give me a couple of names of people I can call and talk to that are a few steps ahead of me in this process. And I'll leave you alone. And he wrote back finally, and he said, I wish I could give you a few names, but I think you're the only guy that I know that's really, in a Western church trying to implement DMM. And it was like, great. I've been on the bleeding edge a few times in my life, and the last thing I wanted to do is be on the bleeding edge again. But, the Great Commission is just too compelling. It's, I'm 65 years old. I'm ready to give whatever life I have left, to see this thing happen. And I'm a little bit like the disciples when, Jesus said, are you going to leave me too? And he's like, where else would you go? Where would we go, Jesus? I don't know any place else to go at this point, but just to keep pushing ahead. But I'm encouraged by you folks here. I don't want to be discouraging, but I do feel like I've been at this the better part of 12 years, and it's like pushing a boulder up a hill. It's like a Sisyphean type task. It's like always pushing and never engaging. But a couple of things I've learned, and I'll just throw those out, and then we'll open it up for questions. And I've learned that that you can't take a strategy from one context and put it into another context without thinking hard about why it worked in one context and why it's not working in another. So my deepest exposure has been in Eastern Africa. My dear friend Isla Tassi and the cascading movements that have happened there. And for me, he's like the gold standard of movement catalysts. And what I learned, in being able to be deeply embedded in those movements there is that they live in a connected context. And as we came back and began to train people, help them understand what it looked like to find persons of peace, to plant the gospel so that it repeats, and where they live, learn, work, and play. And we discovered that we have such a disconnected context in the U.S. And so right off the bat, we saw 4 generations happen in a typical American white suburban neighborhood. But we discovered it happened because we had a phenomenal leader. And you discover this after a while, if you've been around movements, really, really passionate, personally powerful type people can get to 4 generations, usually in one stream, not multiple streams. They can get in one stream. And she was able to push that, but it stopped dead in its tracks after 4 generations and just went dead. And then we came back at it and did postmortems and came back to look at what was going on. And we discovered that our neighborhoods that we're trying to reach are so disconnected that trying to let the gospel move from along relational lines was difficult because there weren't any relationships. And so we had to realize that we had to build relationships in these contexts before we could let the gospel move. So we began to help people understand what it was like to build a neighborhood, to build relational connections, to build the kind of community amongst people that neighbors had. And then we were able to leverage those relationships to begin to start. And we got back to 4 generations again in that process. So, one of the big learnings for us is that we don't have a lot of community to tap into, a lot of natural social networks to tap into. And so oftentimes we have to build those before we can access them. The second thing we learned is that especially in the West, I think this would probably be true of England and all of the West, but in the US, especially Canada, there is a genetic component to an American's DNA that has a definition of church in it. Now, I'm not talking about someone who's hellbound or heaven-bound. I'm not talking about the redeemed and the unredeemed. I'm just talking about, the average U.S. person. Now, this may be not true other places, but and so when they begin to journey spiritually, there's this natural attraction to this thing called church, which usually has a very poor theological definitions to it. It's a box on a corner with a label on it, and so we discovered that it was very difficult to see people come to faith and then not get them to get on a church track. They quickly discovered Christian radio, Christian TV, Christian conferences, Christian podcasts, all kinds of stuff. And the DNA began to, as a result of them being exposed to other types of Christianity, the DNA began to be diluted, especially the multiplication DNA. Because most collective type churches, churches that collects people on Sunday morning, don't have a multiplication DNA in them. They may use the word, but their methodology speaks so loud that they can't get their message across. And so Marshall McLuhan, who was a Canadian, was right. The method is the message in that sense. And so we discovered that the way you do things is oftentimes as important as what you say. And so that was a hard thing for us to realize. And especially in this hybrid world, we used to have this Sunday morning gathering. COVID seems to have destroyed that, but which might be a good thing, actually. And it was difficult for people to get out of that. My good friend Harry Brown, who's the president of New Generations, always says, what you're one with is what you're one to. And so, people come to Shoal Creek on Sunday morning and they hear Van Halen and this really wild guitar solo. We don't have smoke machines, Chris, sorry, but and they hear this wild music and this really, relevant type explanation of a passage in the Bible, and that's what they want. And so they want to come back to that. And so the idea of getting their fingerprints on the Bible, no matter how many times we say that, getting their fingerprints on the Bible and just help them understand this is a great place to start, but a terrible place to stop. You'll never get traction in your spiritual journey if all you're doing is eating this pre-digested truth here. You've got to have this face-to-face relationship with God because of what we did and how we did it. Often people are more attracted to that because the method is the message in that sense. And so we are coming to grips with that even during this COVID period of trying to figure out, how to expand this microchurch network and build out, a different type of ecclesia. Even though I've been at it a long time, 12 years, I'm still in beta mode. It's like everything's beta, it's just crazy. And especially because of COVID, it's given us some grand opportunities that we never thought we'd have so early, so quickly. So I'll stop there, see if anybody wants to pop in, ask a question, or lead us down a rabbit trail.
Thanks, Roy. Yeah, you guys, if you have questions, definitely post them in the chat. You can unmute in a second and ask Roy, but in case somebody's talking, you can post yours there and he'll see it. And Roy, I know you'd say this kind of the way you started out because of how long you've been at it. I mean, and what I try to tell some of these guys that have churches that have grown really quickly, and one thing I think we've learned and that you were saying, when you start to focus on multiplying disciples and you start looking at the parables that are often farming analogies, this takes time. And unless you're willing to be patient, and unless, Roy, right, you're willing to have stubborn perseverance, you're going to give up quick. And so you guys just hear Roy saying he's been at it. He's still as fired up as ever, but it's not overnight. It doesn't happen overnight. And what he was describing is, happening overnight. He was saying, is not the case anymore. So I think one thing I've learned from Roy is we have to be patient. We have to plant seed and understand it takes time. You got to get the sun out and the rain's got to fall. You got to have an irrigation system or something. And it takes time for that good soil to yield the harvest that's 30, 60, and 100 times what's sown. So Roy, on behalf of all of us, thanks for persevering and not quitting yet, and reminding us that you have to have stubborn perseverance, right?
Yeah. It's funny. Go ahead.
John? This is John Murray. How you doing?
Hey, man.
So I have a question. So when you first started exploring DMM, how many years were you into Shoal Creek? What size was Shoal Creek, okay, at that point? And then the ultimate question I wanted to ask you is, if you could go back in time, what would you do different if you could start right now, back, 12 years, I think you said, 12 years ago?
Yeah.
Good question, John. I like the question.
So we, in 2005, I began my quest. So it's maybe a little longer than 12 years, but we were probably averaging, if you want buildings, budgets and butts type thing, we were averaging, in the 800 to 900 range attendance on Sunday morning. What else did you?
So we had that's where you were at.
10 staff members. Now the discouraging things you ought to ask us where we are now. We'll save that for later. Not quite like Chris, but we're headed that way. We were experiencing a fair amount of success in the sense is that we were growing at a good 15% per year clip, maybe sometimes 25. We bought a new building in 2003 and it had a real deflection point there. So we had this real move upwards, but it just was a moment. And if you've read Spent Matches, I had this dream thing go on. I won't tell the whole story for those of you that have heard it before, but I just realized in the dream that an attractional strategy wouldn't achieve the goal that we had of 300,000 people coming to faith. So that that was the spiritual deflection point that put us on the move in 2005 to say, who's got a scalable model of ministry that would allow us to reach what we're praying for? A little bit like Chris's, taking from, the David, help me, Chris, my old mind's going, David Garrison. What's it going to take?
Right.
What's it going to take to reach my people group? So our people group we had defined as 300,000 people, the people that roughly lived in about 30-minute radius of our campus or our county, basically Clay County in Northeast Kansas City. And so, we just realized that our tractional strategy wasn't going to get it. We were doing something. I mean, we'd baptized a couple hundred people up, to that point, maybe 250, 275, something like that. Seen a lot of people come to faith. But the reality is we continue to pray for these 300,000 people. It was just not going to happen in that way. 425 parking spots, maybe 1,600 people in an auditorium. If they were jam packed and the fire marshal kept his eyes closed, we could handle that. And then of course, how many services a week are you going to do, to try to reach all those folks. So it was at that point that we began the trek to look and see what was up and what might be our way of moving forward. So, John, did I think I'm partway there.
Yeah. So the real question was if you could go back in time to, I guess 2005.
Yeah.
What would you do different given what you know now?
And then Roy,
okay.
Why don't you add to that these two questions in the chat also go along with that, which is,
okay.
With the thoughts you've shared so far, how have they impacted your thinking regarding a hybrid model of church?
Okay.
And I guess in the current context, do you think that the hybrid church is still possible? And if not, why not? So maybe you can speak to that.
Okay. Yeah. If I could go back, John, it's one of the learnings I wrote about in Spent Matches is I was the founding pastor. I have a pretty strong personality, love conflict, love to fight. And so, I know what hill I'm going to die on. And if you don't want to die on that hill, then don't come up that hill because I'm dying right here. And, it's kind of my personality. And so it was easy for me to make the mistake of trying to think that I could start this from the front of the room. And so I did. I'm on the platform and I was deceived that people would do what I say. I've got, this relatively successful, bigger church, and I was deceived that, they all listen to me and they do what I say. And so I get up there and I say, hey, we're going to do this, and here's a training class and you all need to go through it and all that kind of stuff. And we did, we put a lot of people through it and we trained a lot of people, but it didn't work that well from the front of the room. If I could go back, I would go back and I would start from the back of the room and I would find a few people who actually had a strong non-believing network of friends. And I would meet with them. I would encourage them. I would coach them. I would build weekly rhythms, monthly rhythms, personally with them, weekly, monthly with them together. And I would realize that that's one learning. Start from the back of the room, not the front of them. The second one would be that I was not adapting a new way of training or discipling or whatever. I was in the culture change business. And I didn't realize, at that point, one of the quotes that's become near and dear to me now, and many of you probably all seen it, but it's, boy, I should quote these things and remember them. My mind's going. Peter Drucker says that, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I didn't realize I was in the culture building business. And even though I had built a church that loved lost people, I mean, we regularly still to this day have people walk out of Shoal Creek on a Sunday morning because they say it's not church. we take that as a badge of honor. You know, we say, well, most people don't like church. Most people are going to hell don't like church. So if you say it's not like church, thank you. We appreciate that. Take your Bible and go down the street. There are 50 churches within 5 minutes of here that do the things that you want. But there are a heck of a lot of people going to hell that live within 5 minutes here that need this. And so, you know, we're fine with that. So I thought we'd built this culture of loving lost people, but we'd also built a seeker church, a church with a distinct culture that said that if I want someone to come to faith, I need to bring them to Sunday morning. And I was changing the culture to say, look, if you want someone to come to faith, invite them to their kitchen table, or better, get yourself invited to their kitchen table and learn to read the Bible and help them discover what God has to say about life. So I was changing culture in a radical way, and I just missed that myself. You know, I just thought, well, you know, movements are about lost people, seeker church is about lost people. So hey, we're all about lost people, so that's fine. And that just wasn't true. I was building culture, and I didn't spend enough time understanding the cultural changes that had to take place to make that happen. So I'm not sure that's really practical, but go ahead.
And then Roy, to follow up, what about the hybrid question? How has your thinking on a hybrid model of church, changed, if it has at all, and especially in this current context? We were talking about this earlier, hybrid model of church in the current context. How is your view changing, and how would you respond to that?
Well, I can let me respond specifically and generally. I'll just say general first. I mean, I still think that for many people, the hybrid church is possible. If you have an existing model that's successful, you can use that existing model as a launching base for disciple making activity. It's hard. It's culture building. It's not training. And stuff. So you realize it's a hard road to hoe that way. I think that's possible. I never intended, and this comes up quite often, I never intended for people who are starting to think about building a hybrid situation. If I were starting over, John, I would not build what I have. If I were starting over, I would do something radically different. It would look more like the Kansas City Underground than it would look like a modern seeker church or whatever. It would be a network of micro churches rather than anything that's in the macro vein. On a personal note, I mean, I just came from a staff meeting in which we're asking ourselves the question, will a non-believer still come to a religious meeting on Sunday morning? And we're actually developing a survey to be able to survey our community to see if that's true, because if it's not true, then what we do on Sunday morning is useless. And we have to pivot in the biggest pivot we've ever seen. What we do know is that most of the people, we have regathered. We're on our third week of regathering, but I got a little bit of a fear this just before I got on this call. I got a voicemail from the Clay County Health Department asking to talk to the most senior person at Shoal Creek. So you may hear about me in the news here soon. Or we may have we may have a COVID outbreak amongst us, and we have to stop gathering. But anyway, as a staff, we're asking ourselves if we need to do the biggest pivot we've ever done in our history, and after 25 years decide that you can't meet the needs of the seeker and the needs of the believer in the same service. That used to be, for those of you that have any exposure to Willow Creek, and should I mention his name, Bill Hybels, that kind of stuff. That was the moniker of the hybrid movement. So if the seekers won't come, then hey, what are we doing? That's kind of, we have to find a different way to access the world in that process. So we've actually kind of modified the hybrid into a tribrid, and that is that we have this, you say come and go, and now we've got this new thing we're working with called here, there, and anywhere. And so this tripart thing that actually brings in our online presence and beginning to understand we have different platforms to reach people with in that process. So yeah, I still think, one of the analogies I think I use in spent matches is the idea of a server church. We still look at the resources that God has given us at Shoal Creek, and we say that, we're a server. We're going to support whatever expression of ecclesia that brings lost people in connection with their Father in heaven that we can. And does that look like a micro church? Does that look like, we've got a guy here in town with a gaming church, online gaming church. We'll do whatever it takes. We'll support whatever we can, with those resources for as long as we have them. And we're not so fixed on form. I think form, form is form. It's just a means to an end. And the end is the idea of Revelation 7:9, where every tribe, tongue, and nation, is gathered around. So I look at all of my tribe here, and it's like, what does it take to get them to that throne? And I don't care what methodology it is. I'm going to use it, whatever it takes. And right now, we find that this disciple making movement strategy is very helpful. And it energizes and mobilizes people to get into the game of reaching their friends, neighbors, and workmates, and helps them express their priesthood of the believer capacity, and stuff. So we feel really good about that. But I would say that, back to the original question, Chris, every situation deserves kind of a unique approach to it, and asking the question, not just, let's just do the hybrid. That's not it. It's like, what's God doing here? What resources do we have? And what can we do? But, right now, I think it's a pretty good bet that most people, believer or not, aren't coming to large gatherings. And so if I were starting now, I definitely wouldn't be doing anything like that.
That's not your main strategy. Yeah.
No,
Hey,
no,
Roy, I think we have time for one more. Brent posted in the chat here, and then we'll do our breakout groups. But he asked, can you unpack what your strategy is for keeping people in a DNA of multiplication versus seeing them drift into the America culture of Christianity that you mentioned? And then what are the best practices for creating a culture of disciple-making multiplication? I think those are good questions.
I try to raise a flag for people, and this sounds extremely proud, maybe, or whatever, but I just want people to question the gospel that they're believing in. If they're believing in a gospel of salvation, that they might want to relook at the scriptures and find out what Jesus talked about, because I believe it's a gospel of kingdom, not a gospel of salvation. If you, like my good friend, another book, if you haven't seen it lately, you need to pick it up and read it. King Jesus Gospel, the beauty of obedience-based discipleship. I tried to get him to change it to disciple making, but it was too late, and Zonford didn't want to work with us. So anyway, David talks about in there, David Young is the author. David talks about, most people have responded to a gospel of Jesus as Savior. And so their normal response is gratitude. Very few of them responded to Jesus as King. The normal response to a gospel of Jesus as King is obedience, is doing what he says. And so I try to hold that up pretty high. And then here's where the pride comes in. I try to paint everyone on the other side of me as in the gospel of salvation, and suggest that, the only way you can avoid that is just by reading the Bible. There's a small body of literature that you can trust in, but by and large, most of the books that you see, on a shelf come out of that gospel of forgiveness So if you've never read King Jesus Gospel by Scott McKnight, another great book, to get a hold of. But I try to keep people in that vein, and I try to keep focusing them on the idea of, here's the DNA of obedience. Here's the DNA of multiplication, and anything that doesn't smack of that. And so, again, I'm trying to quote people I can't remember, but some famous American revolutionary said, Patrick Henry said, people need to be reminded more than they need to be informed. And so one of the things you have to do is find creative ways to consistently remind people. There is an American defect, especially in Christianity, that says, oh yeah, I know it. I got that. Yeah, I got it. And it's like, they don't got it. They just don't got it. And so I just remind people over and over. We use the backwards bike video. For those of you who've seen it, if you haven't, just Google YouTube backwards bike. I built several backwards bikes. Always have them in my training, get people to ride them, help them understand that learning this new way of gospeling is like trying to ride that backwards bike. And in that video, the guy Dustin, he points at the camera and says, "You can't ride this bike." And it's so funny when I ask. I had 16 navigator staff here in my house for last week, doing some training on a pilot project the navigators are doing. And so I showed the video and I asked, show of hands, how many of you, when he said that, you can't ride, how many of you inside? I mean, just thought, I think I could ride that bike. I mean, you don't know who you're talking to here. And, probably 5 or 6 of them, raise their hands and say, yeah, that's kind of the way I was feeling inside. That's an American attitude. You see something impossible. So they think they hear words, it's like, so they hear a bat, they hear a ball, they hear bases, and they think you're talking about baseball when you're actually talking about cricket. Totally different games, totally different rules, totally different ways of scoring. And so you have to keep reminding and reminding and reminding and reminding them. As Isla Tassi would tell you, if you want the kind of things that are happening in East Africa, you have to commit to realizing that you train, and retrain, train, and retrain, train, and retrain. It's just a constant process of making sure that the culture you're building is constantly influenced by the DNA. So you kind of have to, figure out what the DNA is too for you. I think, if you've gone through Chris's training, the 7 habits there that come out of that, 7 elements, of practice and stuff. You've got to keep that cadence going, and you can't ever let up in that process. And it gets tiring at times. I mean, frankly, I have moments of anger, even, at staff members who, it's like, oh my gosh, how long have we been at this? You don't even get this? And it's like, yeah, they don't get it, so you just got to commit to that. And as Chris mentioned before about if you've ever read Seth Godin's book and his talk about the dip, there's always a dip in this process. I mean, there's multiple dips, actually. And oftentimes you get in that dip and it's so discouraging. I remember one time a guy, a pastor from the Northwest, called me, and he was just beside himself. And I let him talk for 30 minutes, It's like, man, this is frustrating. I don't get it. People don't get it. I mean, I don't know if it's worth it, and blah, 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 blah. And he just talks on and on and on. And I said, man, it sounds tough. He goes, yeah, it is. Thanks for listening. All right, see you later. Bye. All he needed was to know someone just understood that, it's tough, but it's worth it. I mean, it's really worth it. And so I love the struggle. And when you see someone's eyes come on, and you see someone released, and you see someone begin to plant the gospel in places where they live, learn, work, and play, it's like, oh my gosh, I'll take all the frustration in the world over that. So, Roy,
would you guys give him a virtual round of applause? Thank you, Roy, so much for coming. And you guys, Roy, I mean, people probably don't tell you enough. You kind of have led the way. You've paved the way for a lot of us in this context to, begin to pursue this in our churches and be able to say, we're not the only ones. There's this guy named Roy. I mean, he started this, and so just thank you so much for your leadership. Thanks for coming. Please come back again. I'm sure these folks will see in other contexts as well, but it's been great.
Yeah.
Thanks for
Well,
being
man, there are so many other people's shoulders that I'm standing on, that, like the Dave Hunts and the Dave Watsons and the David Brudricks. I think you have to have the name David to be in DMM for some reason. But, Isla Tassi, Yunusa Jao, Aichi Bain, all these guys who just poured into me, opened their lives and stuff in. And, it's just, I can't do anything but, give it away because it was given away to me. So
Thanks, Roy. We really appreciate it.
you're welcome, man.